All right, so you know how sometimes it feels like you're drowning in information?
Yeah, definitely. Like every day, there's just this constant stream of new stuff to learn.
Exactly, and it can feel overwhelming, right? You just wish there was a more effective way to cut through all the noise and really understand the important
Like
things.
a shortcut to knowledge that actually works.
Well, today we might just have something that'll pique your interest. We're diving deep into a fascinating concept called space-based learning.
And it completely flips the script on how we think about learning. It's not
It's-
just about passively absorbing information.
It actually incorporates our bodies and our surroundings as key players in the learning process.
And honestly, it's pretty mind-blowing stuff.
For this deep dive, we're going to be exploring an article called Space-Based Learning, Foundation of Book-to-Brain Knowledge Transfer.
Written by Shiva Narayan Takshila Page.
Right, and as the title suggests, it's all about creating this optimized pathway for knowledge to go straight from the page to your brain.
We're talking about maximizing how much you actually understand and retain.
So our mission today is to really unpack the core principles of this space-guided learnography, as it's also known.
And to figure out how it can help us all learn more efficiently and effectively.
So to kick things off, let's start with the fundamental idea behind space-based learning.
So the core concept here is that learning is not just a mental activity.
It's not just about thinking and processing information in our heads.
Exactly. Space-based learning argues that our physical interactions with the space around us and even our movements play a crucial role in how well we learn.
Now, for those of you listening who are interested in the science of learning, this is where it gets really interesting,
This idea actually aligns with some really cool concepts in motor science.
which basically studies how our brains and bodies work together when we move and interact with our environment.
So it's about the brain actively engaging with its surroundings, not just passively receiving information.
Which is a huge shift from the traditional way of thinking about learning, right?
Totally, like sitting in a lecture hall just listening to someone talk.
Space-based learning challenges that model and says that our physical presence and our actions in a learning environment can actually impact how effectively we encode new information.
It's a much more holistic approach.
And the design of the learning space itself is super important.
Like the actual physical layout of the room can make a difference.
The article mentions that well-designed spaces can activate certain areas of our brains.
Like the substantia nigra and the motor cortex.
And I know those sound like very technical terms, but basically these brain regions are really involved in movement and processing rewards and motivation.
So by engaging your body in a softly designed space, you're tapping into those systems that can help you learn better.
It's like how sometimes you remember directions better if you've actually walked the route yourself.
Right, you're physically experiencing the space, and that helps solidify the memory.
So to put all these ideas into practice, the article introduces this thing called the SOTIM framework.
Which stands for Space, Object, Time, Instance, and Module.
So it's not just about randomly throwing things together.
It's a very intentional and structured approach to creating these optimized learning environments.
And one of the coolest elements within this framework is the concept of the happiness classroom.
Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't want to learn in a happiness classroom?
Right, especially when you think about how traditional classrooms can sometimes feel a bit, well, not so happy.
The happiness classroom really flips the script on the role of the learner.
Instead of the teacher being the sole source of knowledge, students are empowered to actively build their own understanding.
The article even talks about this idea of students developing their own brain page.
Which is like building your own personal mental model of the information you're learning.
It's like creating your own internal library of knowledge.
And the cool thing is this active hands-on approach, this motor knowledge transfer, it's actually linked to our emotional well-being.
When learning involves physical engagement, it can be more enjoyable and less stressful.
Think about it. You're way more engaged when you're actively participating in something rather than just passively listening.
Exactly. And the spatial organization of the happiness classroom is all about encouraging that active participation.
It's designed for collaboration, self-directed learning, hands-on task completion.
It's a more holistic approach that considers both the physical and the psychological aspects of learning.
Now, within this larger happiness classroom, we have these smaller groups called miniature schools.
Yeah, these are like little learning hubs within the larger classroom.
And they often have specialized roles for the students within them.
So you might have a group focusing on a specific aspect of a topic.
And this setup encourages peer-to-peer learning, fosters leadership skills, and promotes teamwork.
It's about creating this dynamic flow of knowledge among the students themselves.
And within each miniature school, there's this role called the model learner, sometimes referred to as the small teacher.
And they act as a guide or a mentor for the other students in their group.
Typically, they're students who have a really good grasp of the material, and they can help clarify concepts, answer questions, and keep everyone on track.
It's a really cool way to reinforce their own understanding while also helping their peers.
So it's fostering both individual accountability and collaborative learning.
Right, you're not just relying on the teacher. The students are actively involved in each other's learning.
Now let's talk about transfer books, because these are definitely not your typical textbooks.
No, they're not. The article emphasizes that these books are specifically designed to make that direct book-to-brain knowledge transfer happen.
So unlike traditional textbooks, which often need a teacher to explain the content, transfer books are structured to be more self-explanatory.
They're all about empowering students to learn independently.
And the article talks about how they support brain page development through targeted tasks, active learning, and motor engagement.
What that means is that the books themselves are designed to be interactive.
It's not just passive reading. You're actively engaging with the material through built-in tasks, activities, and prompts.
And the focus on motor engagement means you might be writing, drawing, manipulating objects, even physically moving in response to prompts in the book.
It's like the book itself is a guide leading you through the learning process step by step.
And it's all designed to solidify your understanding through action.
Now we come back to the model learners, and it seems like their role goes beyond just those miniature schools.
Yeah, they have a much broader impact within the learning environment.
They serve as these examples of successful learning for everyone,
And the article highlights this concept of reciprocal learnography.
which is essentially learning by observing and imitating your successful peers.
And this is where the mirror neuron system comes into play.
You know that fascinating part of our brains that activates when we watch someone else do something?
It's like our brains are mirroring the action, even though we're not the ones performing it.
So by seeing a peer successfully grasp a concept or master a skill, it can actually prime our own brains for learning.
It's a really powerful way to learn, and space-based learning incorporates this principle beautifully.
So by having these model learners present in the learning environment, you're creating a culture of achievement and collaboration.
And it shifts some of the instructional burden away from the teacher.
Students are empowered to learn from each other. All right, now let's dive into the science behind all of this, the application of motor science.
This is really the foundation of how knowledge transfer works in this model.
And the key takeaway here is that our physical actions are deeply connected to how our memories are formed and how we retrieve information later on.
Like when we physically write something down or perform a task related to what we're learning.
Or even just the mental rehearsal of what we've learned, those actions all strengthen the neural pathways associated with that knowledge.
It's like building a stronger bridge to that information in our brains.
And within the happiness classroom, they specifically use something called thalamic cycloside rehearsals, or TCR.
Which sounds super complicated, but it's actually a pretty straightforward concept.
It's essentially a structured form of motor repetition.
So you might be physically practicing a skill or repeatedly performing actions that directly relate to what you're learning.
And this physical engagement helps to refine your understanding and really solidify that learning in your long-term memory.
It's about taking abstract information and making it concrete through action.
It's like you're embodying the knowledge you're acquiring. Now, we've mentioned brain page making quite a bit, so let's really unpack what that process is all about.
So think of brain page making as the mental process of organizing new information into a clear and structured format in your mind.
It's like writing a book in your brain, as the article beautifully puts it.
You're creating these interconnected mental maps and modules that allow you to store and retrieve information efficiently.
And how does the space-based learning environment support this brain page making?
Well, the physical layout of the classroom is actually designed to mirror the mental organization of those brain pages.
The task-based learning zones are structured in a way that guides learners to naturally translate their experiences into these well-organized mental frameworks.
So the physical space becomes like a scaffold for how we organize information mentally.
And the benefit of that is that you can access and apply that knowledge more easily without needing constant reminders or explanations.
You've internalized it in a structured way.
Now let's talk about the role of the teacher in this model, because it definitely changes.
Yeah, they become more of a facilitator or a guide rather than a traditional lecturer.
They transition into the role of task moderator.
So instead of being the primary source of information, Their main focus is on supporting students as they engage in these active learning tasks.
They're making sure the learning environment is running smoothly, and they're there to help students when they hit roadblocks.
But they're not spoon-feeding information. They're empowering students to discover it themselves.
So what are some of their key responsibilities as task moderators?
They're overseeing the activities in those miniature schools, monitoring students' progress, providing feedback, reinforcing those motor-driven learning behaviors we talked about.
And they also conduct brainpage testing to make sure students are actively engaging with the material.
It's a much more dynamic and responsive role for the educator.
Now let's move on to the spatial architecture of knowledge transfer.
This is really the heart of how the physical learning space is designed.
Because in space-based learning, the design of the learning environment is absolutely essential.
It's not just an afterthought. It's a core element of the approach.
And the article highlights 4 key components of this spatial architecture.
We've got task zones, movement pathways, learning stations, and observation pods.
So let's break each of those down, starting with task zones.
So task zones are basically designated areas within the learning space that are dedicated to specific types of learning activities.
So you might have a zone for brain page rehearsal, a zone for working with transfer books, a zone for practicing specific skills.
The idea is to create a clear physical and mental distinction between different stages of the learning process.
It's like providing a dedicated space for each type of cognitive activity.
And then we have movement pathways, which are all about encouraging physical movement throughout the learning space.
These might be strategically arranged desks, walkways, open areas.
Anything that encourages students to get up and move around and engage their bodies.
Because we know that physical movement can actually help with cognitive processing and memory retention.
It's like taking a walk to clear your head, but in this case, you're walking to enhance your learning.
Then we have learning stations, which are interactive spaces where students can work with a variety of resources.
This might include transfer books, digital learning tools, hands-on manipulatives.
It's about providing opportunities for students to actively engage with the material in a hands-on way.
So instead of just passively reading, they're experimenting, exploring, and applying what they're learning.
And finally, we have observation pods, which are dedicated spaces for those model learners to showcase their skills and share their strategies.
This is where that peer-to-peer learning and modeling really comes into play.
Other students can observe and learn from their more experienced peers.
It's like having built-in mentors within the learning environment.
So all of these elements, the task zones, the movement pathways, the learning stations, the observation pods, they all work together to create this incredibly rich and engaging learning environment.
And it's all designed to maximize that efficient book-to-brain knowledge transfer and to foster both independent and collaborative learning.
It's a really holistic and well-thought-out approach to education. So to sum it all up, space-based learning through this framework of space-guided learnography and the SOTIM principles presents a really unique and exciting way to think about how we learn.
It's not just about the content, it's about how we interact with that content, both physically and mentally.
And the key takeaway here is that by paying attention to our learning environments, we can actually optimize how our brains absorb and retain information.
And that can make a huge difference in how effectively we learn.
So for all of you listening who are constantly seeking new ways to learn better and to combat that feeling of information overload, I think this framework offers some really intriguing possibilities.
It encourages us to think beyond traditional learning methods and to consider the crucial role of our physical surroundings and our actions in the learning process.
And it raises an important question: how can you apply these principles to your own learning environments?
Whether it's your home study space, your workspace, even how you approach online learning.
Think about which of these elements resonate with you the most.
The active engagement, the incorporation of movement, the creation of dedicated learning zones.
And consider how you might incorporate those elements into your own learning routines.
Because even small changes can make a big difference.
And if you're interested in diving deeper into any of the specific terms we mentioned, like the Taxilla model or learnography, a quick online search will give you a wealth of resources.
There's a whole world of knowledge out there waiting to be explored.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and until next time, keep that thirst for knowledge alive.
Happy learning, everyone.